The screen is black. A single sound, the soft rustle of paper turning. A whisper of aged pages breathing against still air. Then, gradually, an image emerges from darkness. A leather-bound diary, red, almost crimson in the dim light. The cover is worn, its edges frayed by decades of hands and time. A date is embossed in gold leaf on the front, 1887. Just those 4 numbers. No name, no indication of who held this weight in their hands for so many years. The camera moves closer. Dust particles float in the amber light, filtering through an old study window. This is not just a diary. Something about it feels heavier than paper. An ink should feel. Where are you calling from? I want to know. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The narration begins, and with it, a question forms in the mind, the kind of question that cannot be unasked. This is a story about what we see and what we refuse to see. It is about the careful construction of truth and the equally careful construction of lies, both hidden beneath layers of time and respectability. It is about a diary that survived when so many others were destroyed. And it is about a shadow that appeared in a photograph from 1889, a shadow that should not have been there, a shadow that would eventually reveal everything. The diary is open now. Pages flutter. Words appear, elegant handwriting in fading ink. The words are in English, but with particular cadence, the vocabulary of someone educated in the late Victorian era. Someone with authority. Someone used to being obeyed. The pages show sketches, small drawings, botanical studies of plants and flowers. These are innocent-looking notations. These are the kinds of things one might find in any gentleman's journal from that period. But underneath the sketches, if one looks closely enough, there are numbers, prices, quantities, lists that do not match the pastoral imagery above them. For 93 years, this diary sat in a private collection in Connecticut. It was inherited by 3 generations of same family. Each generation treated it with reverence. Each generation kept it locked. Each generation told itself and believed that the diary contained nothing but the botanical observations and philosophical musings of an educated man of the 19th century. This is what families do. They preserve what confirms who they wish to be. They lock away what might complicate that story. The story begins not in 1887, when the diary was first written, but in 2016 in a climate-controlled archive room at Yale University. A historian named Dr. Margaret Chin was conducting research on agricultural practices in the American South during the post-Reconstruction era. She had been invited to examine several private collections that had been donated to the university's special archives. One of these collections belonged to the family we have just mentioned. They believed they were donating the preserved journals of a significant landowner and amateur naturalist. They saw it as an act of cultural stewardship. They saw it as safeguarding history. Dr. Chin had been working in archives for 22 years. She knew the particular smell of old paper, the way dust rises when you turn pages that have not been disturbed in decades. She knew the sound, that distinct whisper, that comes only from 19th century binding and aged leather. She knew how to read between the lines, literally and figuratively. She knew that what people collected and preserved often revealed more truth than what they chose to display. She knew that absences were as meaningful as presences. On the morning of March 14, 2016, Dr. Chen was photographing pages from the diary using the archive's digital imaging system. These photographs will become part of the university's digital collection, searchable and available to researchers around the world. She was working methodically through the document, page by page, her assistant sitting nearby with the image database open. The quality of the digital camera was high, much higher than necessary for simple archival documentation. This would prove to be significant. As the camera photographed the page dated March 3rd, 1889, something caught Dr. Chen's attention. In the lower corner of the image, where the text ended, there was a shadow. Not the shadow one would expect from aged paper or from a natural aging of the document itself. This was a shadow with dimension. This was a shadow with purpose. It was the shadow of a hand. But the hand was not holding the diary. The hand was holding something else. Something the photograph had captured, but the diary itself could not explain. Dr. Chen did not immediately understand what she was seeing. The image on the screen was small. The shadow was subtle. But something in her training, something in her years of reading historical documents, something in particular intuition that comes from decades of careful observation made her pause. She enlarged the image. She adjusted the light levels. She looked at it from multiple angles on the screen. The shadow remained. Clear now, unmistakable. The shadow belonged to a photograph. Specifically, the shadow was the edge of a photograph that someone, likely the diary's author, was holding while he wrote the entry for that particular day. The diary entry itself was brief. It contained only a few lines of observation about the weather and a notation about the arrangement that had been completed this season. 3 words that would, when combined with what came next, change everything. But Dr. Chen did not know this yet. At this moment, she only knew that the shadow revealed a photograph, and she needed to find that photograph. She contacted the family who had donated the collection. She explained, carefully and professionally, that the archive's imaging had revealed evidence of a photograph that may have been housed with the diary in its original form. She asked politely if the family had any knowledge of such a photograph. The family's response came 2 days later, through their lawyer. There was no photograph. There had never been a photograph. The diary was a complete work in itself. There was nothing else in the collection related to that particular document. The family's lawyer made clear that this line of inquiry should cease. But Dr. Chen had not survived 2 decades in academic research by accepting closed doors. She had learned that what people deny most vehemently is often what is most true. She began to search university records from the time of the donation. She requested the original inventory from when the collection had been received. In that inventory, dated 19 months earlier, there was a notation. A single line, easy to miss. It read, 1 leather-bound journal, 1887 to 1891, burgundy leather binding, with photographic plate mounted on interior back cover, removed from binding prior to donation per donor's request. The photograph had been removed, deliberately, by the family themselves. Before they had donated the diary to Yale, they had excised the photograph from its binding. They had separated the image from the text that explained it. They had, in effect, tried to erase a connection that the document's author had deliberately made, but they had not counted on the modern camera. They had not anticipated that the shadow would remain. They had not understood that sometimes the absence of something is more telling than its presence. Dr. Chen's next step was to contact the family again, armed now with the documentary evidence of the photograph's existence. She explained that she had found the inventory record. She expressed her understanding that they had reasons for their choices. And then she asked, with the particular courtesy of someone who knows she holds a crucial card, if they might be willing to discuss where the photograph currently was. The family's response was, for several weeks, silence. Then a letter arrived, not from the lawyer, but from a family's eldest living member, a woman named Eleanor Ashford, who was 91 years old and lived in a house on the same land her family had owned since 1872. The letter was handwritten. It was long, and it contained, finally, the truth. Eleanor Ashford explained that she had known about the photograph for her entire life. Her grandmother had shown it to her when she was 16 years old, made her promise to keep it private, and then had made her swear that she would, upon reaching adulthood, ensure that the diary and the photograph would never be seen together. Her grandmother had told her that what the photograph showed was a matter of family shame that had no bearing on anything that concerned the modern world. These were the exact words Eleanor quoted in her letter. She had honored this request for 75 years. But now, she said, she was old. She had no children of her own, and she was tired of carrying the weight of a secret that was not, in her heart, hers to keep. She included, with the letter, a photograph. It was sealed in an archival envelope. She had kept it carefully all these years, and she wanted it to go to Dr. Chen, but only on one condition, that Dr. Chen would understand the full context before the photograph was ever made public, that she would take time to understand not just what the photograph showed, but what it meant, that she would treat it not as a curiosity or a scandal, but as historical evidence of something important. Dr. Chen received the package on a Thursday in late April. She placed a sealed envelope on her desk for several hours before opening it. She sat with the sealed envelope and thought about what it might contain. She thought about the shadow. She thought about the careful excision of the photograph from the diary's binding. She thought about an old woman, 91 years old, finally releasing a secret she had carried her entire adult life. And then she opened the envelope. The photograph was a carte de visite, a small photograph of the type that was extremely common in the 19th century. It measured approximately 5 inches by 4 inches. It was mounted on cream-colored cardstock. The image was slightly faded, as one would expect from a photograph that was more than 125 years old. It showed 2 figures. The man on the left was the diary's author, Edmund Ashford. He was a man of 64 years at the time the photograph was taken. He wore the formal attire of a prosperous landowner in 1889, a dark suit, a waistcoat, a watch chain. He was posed in a manner typical of that era, standing, formal, unsmiling, as was customary for photography at that time. But it was not Edmund Ashford who commanded attention in this photograph. It was the figure to his right. A young girl, no more than 13 years old, stood beside him. She wore a simple white dress. Her hair was long and dark and unbound. She was looking slightly away from the camera, her gaze directed at something beyond the frame. Her expression was difficult to read in the faded image, but it was not the expression of a child who was comfortable. It was not the expression of a child who wanted her portrait taken. And around her waist, in Edmund's hand, was a chain. A gold chain, beautifully crafted, ornamental in its refinement. The kind of chain one might expect to see decorating a woman's waist at a formal ball. But this was no formal ball. This was a photograph taken inside what appeared to be Edmund Ashford's study, the same study where he would write his diary entries. The girl was not being posed as a companion or a ward or a relative who happened to be present. She was being posed as a possession, as something Edmund owned, as something to be displayed. Dr. Chin stared at this photograph for a very long time. She did not touch it. She did not move. She simply looked at it, and as she looked, she understood why the family had needed to hide it. She understood why the photograph had needed to be separated from the diary. She understood why an old woman had carried the weight of this image for 75 years. But understanding why it had been hidden was not the same as understanding what it was exactly that the photograph showed. Dr. Chin knew enough about the period to recognize certain indicators, certain visual language that she had encountered in historical research. She knew enough to understand that this was not a normal family portrait, but she needed more information. She needed documentation. She needed proof. She contacted Eleanor Ashford again. This time, her letter asked a very specific question. Who was the girl in the photograph? The response came within a week. Eleanor was old, but she was still sharp. Her letter provided a name and, more importantly, a paper trail. The girl's name was Harriet. She had been enslaved by the Ashford family before the Civil War. She had been born on their plantation in South Carolina in 1876. After the war, she had remained in the region, as had many formerly enslaved people. The Ashford family had relocated to Connecticut in 1881. Harriet had come with them. Eleanor's letter included a document, a bill of sale dated 1881, in which the Ashford family had purchased Harriet from another family for the sum of $800. This was unusual because slavery was illegal in 1881. What Eleanor was describing, and what this bill of sale documented, was not legal slavery. It was human trafficking. It was a continuation of enslaved labor under a different name, in a different legal framework, but with the same essential reality, a human being owned by another human being. Eleanor's letter went on to explain what she knew from her grandmother's accounts, what had been passed down through family whispers and silences. After the family moved to Connecticut, Harriet had been kept in the household. She had been given minimal education, minimal freedom, minimal acknowledgement of her humanity. She had been put to work in domestic labor. She had been, according to Eleanor's account, made use of in various ways that the family preferred not to discuss. These were Eleanor's careful words. The meaning beneath them was clear enough. The photograph, Eleanor explained, had been taken by Edmund Ashford himself. It was what he considered proof of his ownership. Just as colonizers took photographs of lands they had seized, just as collectors took photographs of objects they possessed, Edmund had taken a photograph to document his possession of Harriet. The chain was not metaphorical. The chain was the kind of chain that would have been worn by enslaved people in the centuries before. It was an announcement. It was evidence. It was, in Edmund's mind, a record of his power over another human being. Harriet had disappeared in 1892. Her fate was unknown. Eleanor did not know whether she had escaped, whether she had been sold away, whether she had died. There were no records. There was no documentation of what had happened to her. She had simply vanished from the family's accounts. And after she vanished, Edmund had presumably removed the photograph from his diary and put it away. It was too dangerous to keep accessible. It was too direct a proof of what he had done. Dr. Chin realized, as she read Eleanor's account, that she was no longer simply examining a historical document. She was examining evidence of a specific crime: human trafficking, false imprisonment, exploitation. She was examining a photograph that was, in effect, a confession, and she was holding in her hands a single thread that, if pulled correctly, might unravel a much larger story. She contacted Harriet's descendants. This required detective work. She searched census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses. She found a woman named Harriet Samuel living in Hartford, Connecticut in 1900. This Harriet would have been the right age. She had listed her occupation as domestic servant and her race as colored. She had married a man named Thomas Samuel. They had 2 children. The trail went from there into the 20th century, through generations, until finally, Dr. Chin made contact with Harriet Samuel's great-granddaughter, a woman named Monica Williams, who was professor of African American history at Howard University. Monica Williams received Dr. Chen's email and did not immediately respond. She read it, closed her laptop, and sat in silence for several hours. The email contained the photograph as an attachment. Monica had studied family history. She had documented records of her own ancestors. She had always known that Harriet Samuel, her great-great-grandmother, had come to Connecticut as a young person under unclear circumstances. But there had been no documentation, no records. Her family had maintained their own silence, just as the Asher family had maintained theirs. The photograph changed everything. It made visible what had been hidden. It provided proof of what had been denied. Monica Williams called Dr. Chin within an hour of resuming her work that day. Over the course of the next months, Dr. Chin and Monica Williams worked together to research what had happened to Harriet. They examined period documents. They interviewed descendants of both families. They traced the path of Harriet's life from 1881 forward. They found a record of her marriage to Thomas Samuel in 1899. They found her name listed on the 1900 census. They found, in a Hartford newspaper archive, a notice of her death in 1963. She had lived to the age of 87. She had borne children. She had raised a family. She had built a life, which was, in and of itself, an act of profound resistance. But the most important evidence they found was contained in Harriet's own papers, which Monica had inherited from her mother. In Harriet's handwriting, in letters she had written to family members but never sent, were accounts of her years in the Ashford household. These letters, never before made public, preserved by Harriet's descendants with the same care that the Ashford family had used to hide the photograph, provided a first-person account of what it meant to be trapped, to be used, to be denied recognition of one's humanity. Harriet had written about the chains, but not in the way the photograph showed them. She had written about the invisible chains, about the way fear had bound her more securely than any metal ever could. In one letter, dated 1902 and addressed to a sister she had left behind in the South, Harriet had written, "The photograph was meant to show that I belonged to them like a thing belongs to its owner, but I kept myself separate from it. I kept the part of me that mattered inside where they could not take it. The chains in the picture were real, but I was not the chains. I was a woman wearing the chains, and that woman could not be owned, no matter what picture they took to prove otherwise." When Dr. Chun and Monica Williams shared the full story with the historical community, the response was immediate and significant. The photograph was reproduced in academic journals. It was featured in exhibitions on post-Reconstruction slavery and human trafficking. It was used to illustrate how slavery continued by other names and under other legal frameworks well into the 20th century. It became a crucial piece of evidence in the historical record of what scholars came to call domestic slavery in the North during the late 19th century. But something unexpected happened as well. The photograph spread beyond academic circles. It was shared on social media. It was featured in podcasts about hidden history. Thousands of people who had no background in history or academia saw the photograph. And these people, descendants of enslaved peoples, people whose own families carried their own hidden photographs and hidden stories, people who recognized in Harriet's expression something of their own family's untold pain. These people saw something that scholars had documented, but that needed to be felt, not just understood. The Ashford family responded by releasing a public statement. They acknowledged the photograph's authenticity. They acknowledged the connection to Harriet. They established, with Monica Williams as an advisor and co-director, a scholarship fund in Harriet's name. They commissioned a historical marker for Harriet at the cemetery in Hartford, where she was buried, a grave that had been unmarked for 60 years. They opened their archives fully to researchers, holding nothing back. And Eleanor Ashford, 92 years old at this point, gave an interview in which she explained why she had finally chosen to release the photograph. "My grandmother made me keep the secret," Eleanor said, "because she believed she was protecting family honor, but the honor she was trying to protect was built on someone else's dishonor, on someone else's captivity, on someone else's pain. I kept the secret for so long because I believed that was what loyalty meant. But loyalty to what? To people long dead? To a version of the past that never existed? At a certain point, you realize that keeping a secret is just a way of keeping a lie alive. And keeping a lie alive means keeping the truth dead." The diary itself was eventually published, with full context and annotation. Every entry was cross-referenced with period documents, census records, and Harriet's own letters. The botanical sketches that Edmund had included were revealed to be more than just casual observations. They were records of plants that had been known for their use in reproductive control, in pain management, in the management of suffering. In context, they told a story not just of botanical interest, but of medical knowledge being applied in ways that were intended to control and contain Harriet's body. The price list that Dr. Chin had noticed, the numbers written beneath the innocent-seeming sketches, were revealed to be records of expenses related to Harriet's maintenance. They itemized the cost of her food, her clothing, her housing. They quantified her, turning her into a budget line item, no different than the cost of maintaining a horse or a house. This was the mathematical language of ownership. This was proof that Edmund had thought of Harriet not as a person, but as a business proposition. The shadow on the page, dated March 3rd, 1889, became one of the most discussed historical details of the year. Museums commissioned photography experts to study it, to learn how such a subtle visual anomaly could reveal so much. Academic papers were written about the shadow that told the truth. Photographers and historians collaborated on projects about how photographs preserve evidence not just of what we choose to show, but of what we accidentally reveal. But perhaps the most important outcome of the discovery of the photograph was this. It opened a conversation about how many other photographs existed in archives, in private collections, in the basements and attics of families across America. How many other images contain within them the evidence of exploitation, of violence, of the continuation of slavery by other names? How many other diaries contain within them shadows of photographs that reveal what the text alone could not? How many other families were sitting on evidence of historical crimes, maintaining their own careful silences? Monica Williams, after the photograph's revelation, gave a lecture at Howard University. At the end of that lecture, she said something that would resonate with people who studied this history for years to come. The photograph was meant to be a record of ownership. It was meant to be Edmund's proof that Harriet belonged to him. But what it became was the opposite. It became proof that Harriet's humanity could not be owned. Because here we are more than 100 years later, and we're looking at this photograph and asking ourselves, who was this girl? What was her life? What did she want? What did she dream? And we care about those questions. We want to know. We want to see her as a person, not as a possession. That's exactly what Edmund didn't want us to do. And that's exactly what the photograph ended up making possible. By trying to record his ownership, he created a record of her resistance. He documented his own crime so thoroughly that he left no room for doubt or denial. The diary still exists, kept now in Yale's special collections under climate-controlled conditions. The photograph is displayed in museum exhibitions on slavery, on human trafficking, on the hidden histories of the North. Harriet's letters are reproduced in textbooks about African American history. Her grave in Hartford has become a site of pilgrimage for people seeking to honor the memory of ancestors whose stories have been hidden. And Edmund Ashford is remembered not as the prosperous landowner and amateur naturalist that his contemporaries believed him to be, but as he actually was, a man who enslaved a child, documented his ownership, and then tried to hide the evidence. His reputation, 130 years after his death, has been fundamentally altered by a shadow that should not have been there, a shadow that he never intended to leave, a shadow that proved, finally, to be more honest in all of his words. In 2019, Dr. Chun and Monica Williams co-authored a book about their research. It was titled The Shadow Revealed: Harriet's Story and the Hidden Histories of American Slavery. The book won the Bancroft Prize, one of the highest honors in American historical research. In the acknowledgments section, they both thanked Eleanor Ashford for her courage in finally choosing truth over family loyalty. They thanked the archivists and photographers whose care had preserved the evidence. And they thanked Harriet Samuel herself, whose own words, preserved in letters she never sent, had ultimately become the record that mattered most. We did not discover Harriet, the authors wrote in their introduction. Harriet discovered herself. She wrote herself into history through words that were never meant to be published, through letters that were never meant to be read by anyone but the family members she was writing to. Her descendants, all of them, made a choice to keep her voice alive when it would have been easier to let it disappear. They kept the letters safe, when keeping anything safe in a world designed to make you invisible requires an act of faith. This book is the result of that faith being justified. This is Harriet speaking. This is history correcting itself. This is a shadow finally being brought into the light. And what happened to the diary after all of this came to light? It remained on the shelves of Yale's special collections. But it was no longer a document that belonged to Edmund Ashford. It had become a document that belonged to Harriet. Her story had reclaimed it. Her truth had repurposed it. The photograph he had hidden within its pages, intended to prove his ownership of her, had instead become the proof of something he never intended: that she was worth remembering, that her story mattered, that her voice, even when silenced, would eventually be heard. The shadow that should not have been there became the shadow that changed everything. It became the shadow that told the truth when every document, every law, every institutional power had been arranged to hide it. In the end, what Edmund Ashford had tried so carefully to conceal, and what his family had tried to protect by separating the photograph from the diary, was revealed not by accident, but by the patient work of people who refused to accept easy answers, who looked closely at shadows, who understood that sometimes what we choose not to see is far more important than what we do see, and who believed, fundamentally, that the truth, once set in motion, cannot be stopped. This is a story of a diary and a photograph, but more than that, it is the story of a shadow that would not be silenced. It is the story of what happens when the invisible is finally seen. And it is the story of a young girl named Harriet, whose face appears in a photograph she never wanted to be in, but whose life, once properly understood, shines so brightly that no one can look away. But the story did not end with the publication of the book or with the academic recognition that followed. The shadow, once revealed, cast itself further and further into the public consciousness. Museums began to reach out. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell Harriet's story in motion. Universities asked if they could create courses around the diary and photograph. And most significantly, amateur historians and genealogists, people who had no academic credentials but who carried their own family stories, began to come forward with similar photographs, similar documents, similar shadows that they had found in their own archives. A woman named Patricia Henderson, living in Philadelphia, contacted Dr. Chen. She had found, among her great-grandmother's belongings, a series of photographs from the 1870s and 1880s. In each photograph, there were details that seemed wrong, anomalies, just like the shadow in Harriet's story. A chain visible in the background of what appeared to be a family portrait. A manacle partially hidden beneath someone's sleeve in another image. Metal fixtures that seemed too deliberate, too placed to be accidental. Patricia had spent years looking at these photographs without understanding what she was seeing. The shadow in Harriet's photograph gave her a framework. It gave her permission to ask the questions she had been afraid to ask. She sent the photographs to Dr. Chun and Monica Williams. Within weeks, they had identified that Patricia's great-grandmother had been a woman named Elizabeth, enslaved in Philadelphia despite the city's reputation as a place where slavery had been gradually phased out. The photographs documented her enslavement in a northern city, in conditions that were, in many ways, more hidden and more complete than Southern slavery had ever been. Northern slavery was something most Americans, even educated Americans, did not believe had existed to any significant degree. But the photographs proved it. The shadow had revealed not just one history, but an entire category of hidden history that had been buried beneath the presumption that the North had always been free. Monica Williams gave a lecture at Howard University about what she called the proliferation of shadows. She explained to her students that once you learned to see one's shadow, you began to see them everywhere, not just in photographs, but in archives and official records, in the silences between what documents said and what documents failed to say. She described how the shadow in Harriet's photograph had become a teaching tool, not just for the history of slavery and trafficking, but for a broader methodology of historical research. "We teach you to read documents," she said to her class. "We teach you to analyze photographs. We teach you to cross-reference sources. But we don't always teach you to look at what's missing. We don't teach you to listen to silence. We don't teach you to see shadows as evidence." Harriet's photograph taught us to do all of those things. One of Monica's students was a young woman named Keisha Johnson, a descendant of people formerly enslaved in Massachusetts. Keisha became obsessed with the methodology that the Harriet case had demonstrated. She began to develop a project, what she called the Shadow Archive, a digital repository where people could upload photographs, documents, and family stories that contain these kind of anomalies, these visual inconsistencies that might indicate hidden slavery or trafficking in the North. She created a system where volunteer historians and students could analyze the images together, could crowdsource the interpretation of shadows and silences. Within 6 months of its launch, the Shadow Archive had received submissions from more than 2,000 people. There were photographs from New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Rhode Island, states that official history had claimed had abolished slavery by the early 1800s. There were photographs that showed chains, manacles, collars, and other instruments of restraint that had been hidden in the background or partially visible. There were family letters that contained coded language describing arrangements and situations that began to make sense once you understood what you were looking for. There were bills of sale, like the one Eleanor Ashford had provided, documenting the purchase of human beings years or decades after slavery was supposedly illegal. The project generated significant media attention. News outlets ran stories about the hidden slavery of the North. Academic journals published papers analyzing the archive's findings. And most importantly, thousands of people began to understand that their family histories were more complicated, more dark, and more important than they had previously believed. Some were descendants of the enslaved. Some were descendants of the enslayers. Many were both, products of relationships formed under coercion, under imbalance of power, under conditions that were never named clearly at the time and have been actively concealed ever since. An older man named Robert Whitney, living in Boston, submitted a photograph to the archive. The photograph was of his great-grandfather, a man named Thomas Whitney, taken in 1885. In the photograph, Thomas stood beside a young boy, perhaps 10 years old. The boy was also in formal dress, posed as if for a family portrait. But around the boy's neck was a collar, not a shirt collar or a decorative element, a metal collar. And in Thomas's hand was a length of chain connected to that collar. Robert Whitney had inherited this photograph from his grandmother. For his entire life, he was now 73 years old. He had assumed it was a family portrait. He had shown it to relatives over the decades. No one had ever questioned it. No one had ever said, "Wait, that's a collar, that's a chain, That's documentation of slavery. The image had been so familiar, so normalized within his family, that it had simply become invisible. He had been looking at it for 60 years and not seeing what was in front of him. When he submitted it to the Shadow Archive, he included a note, "I don't know why no one ever asked about this. I don't know why I never asked. But now that I've looked at other photographs, now that I've read about Harriet, I cannot look away. I need to know who this child was. I need to know what happened to him. I need to stop pretending that my family history was innocent." The photograph went viral on social media. It became the symbol of the Shadow Archive, the image that made clear what Northern slavery had looked like. It showed a man whose face was proud, confident, comfortable. It showed a child whose face was turned slightly away, whose expression was difficult to read, but whose physical position, chain, collared, displayed, was unmistakable. The contrast between the two faces, the two bodies, the two relationships to the camera and to the moment being documented, became the defining image of a difficult national reckoning. Robert Whitney was eventually able to identify the child in the photograph. His name was Samuel. Samuel had been enslaved by Thomas Whitney from 1880 to 1887. After 1887, there were no more records of Samuel in Boston. He had disappeared from the city's documentation, just as Harriet had disappeared from Edmund Ashford's records. But unlike Harriet, Samuel's disappearance could not be traced. No census records, no marriage license, no death certificate. Samuel had simply vanished. The last documented reference to him was in a Boston newspaper from 1887, a brief notice of an auction, not of property, but of people. The document listed Samuel, age 12, strong and able, suitable for labor, among other items up for auction. The revelation that Robert Whitney's great-grandfather had been involved in the active sale of a human being in 1887, more than a century after slavery was supposedly abolished in Massachusetts, became a catalyst for a much larger national conversation. If this had happened in Boston, one of America's most historically celebrated cities, how many other cities had similar histories? How many other family photographs contained similar evidence? How many other silences had been maintained around similar crimes? Monica Williams and Dr. Chin were invited to speak before the United States House of Representatives Committee on Education and the Workforce. They testified about the significance of uncovering these hidden histories and about what educational changes would be needed to ensure that future generations were taught accurate history. They brought with them a selection of photographs from the Shadow Archive. They displayed them on screens in front of the committee. Some of the photographs were so disturbing, so clear in their documentation of human suffering and restraint, that several committee members asked for a brief recess before continuing. "We are not showing you these images to cause pain," Monica Williams said to committee. "Although pain is the appropriate response to viewing evidence of this kind, we are showing you these images because they are evidence. They are documentation. They are the shadows that were never meant to be seen, but which have survived nonetheless."